But it varies on
You don't need them?
We do not lease.
Oh, I thought you did. I thought it was, you just sell them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Whoever is keeping time, please note that this gentleman is 10 minutes late starting because of our break. Charles Baxley, are you paying attention to that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
But George and Carol said I couldn't hit the goal.
There is a change in the program that some of you have. If your name tag was done earlier, you do not have the change on it. You might have Dave Nealon for this period, but there has been a change because Dr. Poteat has to leave and do things that are official. And so we'll have to leave, he is presenting now. You know, we think of Marion and the tremendous intelligence that he had. We know that he knew lots of things, and we don't always know how that happens. So today we have a professional who will tell us about intelligence and the American Revolution. Dr. Poteat?
I'm a little bit peeved at not having been warned, not to bother with wearing a tie. I'm sorry for that. But, and you're lucky, I have no slides, so we turn the lights on so you can sit up straight and stay awake. Everything I've known and ever done or written in my life has been secret, so I can't put it down in writing. In preparing for this session, I learned something that I really hadn't known before, and that is the similarities between George Washington's education and that of Francis Marion. It turned out both had an amazing introduction into the spy game. At the end of the Revolutionary War, when America won its independence, the chief of British intelligence was a man by the name of Major George Beckwith. He had been replaced. The other head of British intelligence, whose name was John Andre, and Washington had captured the British chief of intelligence and hanged him in the same fashion and in revenge for the way that the British had executed Nathan Hale earlier. The British had left Nathan Hale dangling for 4 days in his stocking feet as a lesson to any other American that might defy the British. When Washington captured their chief of intelligence, he offered to let him go back to the British ranks, providing they would return the American traitor Benedict Arnold back over to George Washington. Arnold didn't want that at all, so he refused. So Washington went ahead and hanged John Andre in the same fashion. But when the war finally ended and the British were leaving New York with their in defeat going back to England, their new chief of British intelligence, George Beckwith, made the following statement to the British press, which was recorded. He said the following: George Washington and his ragtag rebels did not outfight we British on the battlefield. These old foxes simply outspied us. So he gave credit to the winning of the Revolutionary War to the superior intelligence operations of Washington and others such as the gentleman we're hearing from today, Francis Marion. But a little bit about the similarities. It turns out Washington had learned a very hard lesson early on when he was in the Virginia militia fighting the Indian Wars during the French and Indian War. Washington was a young officer in the Virginia militia, and he had joined British General Braddock on this march out to the Monongahela Valley, which is near Pittsburgh. And this magnificent British force, with their red uniforms and so on, were marching out there to engage and fight the French and Indians in a battle. They were ambushed, and they were wiped out. Washington had bullet holes in his shirt, in his coat, but he survived. As a matter of fact, he helped rally some of the survivors to get them back to Virginia. General Braddock was killed. Most of his officers were killed. They were ambushed by the French and Indians, who had shouted them all the way toward Pittsburgh. But Washington learned something. The lesson he learned was, don't ever go into battle unless you have intelligence about your chances, or whether you can win or lose. And he never forgot that lesson, and it served him well. He got a bad start, however, because when the war first began, his first effort in spying was to send Nathan Hale into New York to learn what's going on. But Nathan Hale was an unlikely spy. He was well over 6 feet tall and had flaming red hair. He stood out in the crowd. And, so, as I say, it was not a good start. But look what Francis Marion did. As a young man, he was in the militia in South Carolina. And he learned a hard lesson early on about the time the French and Indian War. We had these Cherokee Indian Wars in South Carolina. And it turned out Francis Marion had fought in those wars very successfully. But as a young man, he grew up and he had even played, and he learned all the tricks and the trades that the Indians knew. The Indians knew how to fight, how to ambush, and so on, and how to have a network of informants to know when and how to plan your ambushes, your hit-and-run tactics. So Marion learned his lesson, the same lesson, if you will, that George Washington learned. So as time went on, we have these two men that turned out to have been significant in the creation of our nation, primarily because of their skills, not just on the battlefield, but off the battlefield. They remembered the secret of winning a war, which was taught by the Chinese general, thousands of years earlier, named Sun Tzu. He said, the essence, the acme of skill is to know the enemy and defeat him off the battlefield. In other words, don't fight him if you don't have to. Defeat him otherwise using intelligence. So the interesting thing about the early days of the war, Washington's had completely infiltrated the British ranks, and he knew everything that they were planning. Most of us know about the battle that changed the tide of that war, was that Trent, when Washington crossed the Delaware. But did you know, and Washington didn't lose a man. He killed the chief, the general and colonel that was managing the Trenton garrison. But it was an easy job because George Washington had his spy inside Trenton that had tipped him off on everything he needed to know to win that battle. And Washington also learned one other trick that Marion learned. If you want to have a good spy that hates the British, get an Irishman. and so his spy that was inside of Trenton was named John Honeyman. Yeah, John Honeyman was an Irishman. And many of the Scotch-Irish that were spies in the network in South Carolina were also Irish. They had other skills besides fighting and spying. It turned out that Washington had infiltrated, he had his own spy. It was known as the fox in the English hen house. He had a man named Haines Solomon who could speak several languages, especially German, and so the British hired Haines Solomon to be an interpreter between the British officers and the Hessians, who happened to also be one of Washington's spies. The most significant spy, perhaps, in Washington has been the greatest mystery to date. Many of you have read about it, but in the New York spy ring called the Culper Spy Ring, that ring knew every move that the British planned to make from their headquarters in New York City. And that spy has never been identified to this date, but her name, she was known as Agent 355. It turned out that Agent 355 happened to have been well connected through all of the the British officers in New York. And she knew the chief of British intelligence, John Andre. And it was her information to Washington that eventually led to Washington capturing their chief of intelligence. But after that took place, the British were so taken back at having lost their chief of intelligence to be hanged by George Washington. They did a sweep of New York and picked up every American that might have even known any of the high-ranking British people. And in this network of sweeping up these Americans, they picked up Agent 355 as the woman who had known John Andre. And the only evidence they had is that she had known him. But they put her on a prison ship in the harbor there in New York, and she died from malnutrition and bad health. There was nothing worse and more inhumane during that war than the British prisoner ships. They were off of Charleston, New York, Delaware, but to this day, no one knows the name of the woman. It's known as Agent 355. But anyway, it was a good show, and but Washington's spy network was complete throughout the entire 13 colonies. One of the ways that this network was established was that Washington was well known as a great Mason, and they had the Masonic orders throughout the colonies. And many of these Masonic lodges were networks and were the nest for many of Washington's spies. And that carried right on down into Charleston, South Carolina, and there was a network there. Now, the truth about the War of Independence is worse than we've been reading about in our history books. It was the bloodiest civil war this country has ever had. It was not so much about the British Royal Army and the American Continental Army. It was about the ravaging Tories, who were nothing more than a lynch mob going around killing and burning the homes of all the patriots, especially in South Carolina. But nonetheless, these Tories were British loyalists, And they usually were from the cities where they enjoyed the good life. If you remember, the British occupied the cities, and the Patriots were in the outlying areas. And the British plans for the colonies were always to keep them, you might say, barefoot, and to provide raw materials for the British system, manufacturing system. They didn't want any independent church, but they wanted us for raw materials only. And those Americans, the colonials, who supported the British in that, lived the good life in the cities. So these were the Tories. And it's no wonder that as the war got on and we had this terrible, bloody civil war, the Tories were armed by the British and given British weapons. And they became the terrorists at the time. They would go into any patriots or colonials' home, they would burn it, and they would kill the people in it. And the movie that we've all seen, I'm sure, called The Patriot, is fairly accurate, but it misses one point. It puts all of this destruction in the hands of the British, the Royal Army. But the truth is, it was the deadliest part turned out to have been the Tories and the civilian British supporters. Fundamentally, what we had, and we've read about this, is that the spy network that Marion had in South Carolina was often referred to as his scouts. But it turned out the damage that the Tories did caused those colonials and Americans to become informers for Marion's network. So we hear a lot about it, but he had a hard, well-wired network of people that he could count on for information. And he had all the information he needed to survive. And, but the idea that they were called scouts, what changed around, these were his spies. And they were they were always at risk because these informers and these people were not always part of his army. They were his spy network. And they knew who the Tories were. They knew their plans, and they could report back to Marion, and it was an extremely, extremely effective. The reason Marion was so successful in his guerrilla operations at both were two things: his knowledge that he learned earlier as a young man in the Cherokee Indian Wars, and the information he got from his network of informers, spies, and scouts. He had all he needed to survive. You've heard all the stories about his exploits, but I won't go into many of those, but in all cases, it turned out that he had a network that gave him the information he needed to survive, and then he could use his tactics he learned from the Indians, by the way, to ambush and hit and run. The British were very upset with him because he was effective and he didn't fight fair. He didn't line up in a row and put on a red coat, blue uniforms, and then go toe-to-toe and then shoot it out. Well, he wouldn't do that. He fought the classical American way, going back to the early days in Boston when the war first started. But some of the interesting, as a matter of fact, Marion was a tiny, he was a short man, he was thin, and he was unhealthy as a kid. He just didn't look like that he would ever become a strong warrior. And he was the youngest of a large family, a lot of kids, 7 or 9, I've forgotten, some large number. And he was on the small farm out here nearby the town where he really grew up is now underwater at Lake Marion. But nonetheless, he wanted to go to the sea and be a sailor as a young man. And he tried it. He ran off and got on a schooner. On that one voyage, the ship eventually sank. He ended up in a lifeboat for several days with people dying, but that little man survived, and that ended his thoughts about becoming a sailor. But anyway, he came back and he got older, he got stronger physically, and he was known as short, lean, or tawny. We would call it wiry today. But it turned out that when, during his battle with the famous Colonel Tarleton, he finally, he became so effective, however, that when he called for a meeting with Colonel Tarleton to have dinner with him under a flag of truce. But when Tarleton arrived, he didn't see anybody that looked like a soldier to him, and he was about to leave. And when someone said, no, that's Francis Marion over there, this little pipsqueak guy. But after they met, and you'll hear the story this afternoon about that famous sweet potato dinner, because that's all Marion had to offer him to eat. But during that meal, which was served, all Francis Marion had, his troops had, they lived on sweet potatoes. The British and Tories had wiped out all the crops and livestock of everybody that they could find, but Francis Marion lived on sweet potatoes because they were grown underground and the British missed them. So when it came time to entertain his adversary, Colonel Tarleton, he served him sweet potatoes on a piece of pine bark. That's only, but that so impressed Tarleton, and I think that was almost the beginning of the end for Tarleton and the British, because here's a man, wiry, small, but so dedicated, and that can live on this and knows his way around the swamps. He said, there's no hope. We really can't. We can't win over guys like that. So I think that was a big change in the story there. But anyway, it turned out that, by the way, one of the advantages of being the speaker just before lunch is I guarantee you will not be late. I'll get you back on schedule right away. Marion got his start when he when the British took over Charleston, and they had at least 500 patriots in an army. They were all captured, but a few that escaped got away, and Marion was eventually put together his guerrilla army right near here in these swamps. And it was amazing that that one man, and the British thought they had the South. They already occupied control all of Georgia, and they had all the major towns in South Carolina, the coastal towns. But the interior, that group grew and eventually defeated probably one of the strongest armies ever. But the one thing that anyone with a spy network has to worry about, be it in that war or the Cold War we've just seen recently, there's one thing that you have to guard against that's frightening. And that is if you have a traitor in your own ranks that might be one of the agents of one of your spies or scouts that knows all about you. He knows your routes, he knows your camps, your hiding places. And it happened, that befell Francis Marion himself. He planned a major operation against a British force at this plantation. But as he approached there, he learned from another spy. This is how the spy game works. One spy said, there's been a defector that's left our ranks, and he's now with the British in that plantation, and they know we're coming. So the British were about to turn and wipe out in that one move Marion's group. But fortunately, one spy told about another spy, the traitor and the defector, and Marion, instead of going in, he turned and retreated. And the British were right on him. And that was the famous retreat through the swamps. And the traitor who was now defected and was working with the British was able to tell them where Francis Marion might go. They knew his camps, his trails, and his what he might do. And he went that way, one just ahead of the other. And finally, Tarleton thought he had him. And he sent his, he had a few cavalrymen ahead to finally trap and kill the swamp fox. But the long and short of it is they never quite made it. Francis Marion and his troops knew the swamp and knew how to survive, and they did. And finally, at the last, the English gave up the chase. And that was the end of the war as far as they were concerned. And that's when Tarleton gave the name, that old swamp fox. That said, we'll never catch it. There's nothing we can do. But fundamentally, that was the end of that. And you know the story. You've heard it today. And it's a magnificent story. I'm going to keep us pretty much on schedule and offer an opportunity for any questions that you may have. I'll hang around so that you don't lose your schedule too much. But I'd like to mention that I've had an association called the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, AFIO. We have a website, and we publish an intelligence journal quarterly. And this is one from a few years back. It was published. And this journal goes to all the colleges and universities that teach intelligence. It goes to all the congressional staffs and to our 5,000 members around the country. And in this particular issue, in 2002, there's an article about the spy network of Francis Marion. It's a wonderful journal, and if any of you are ever interested in keeping up with the history of intelligence, you're welcome to get some information. I'll leave these flyers somewhere at the back. You can take a look at it. And I think that I'm stretching our schedule. So I'll stop here, but I would entertain if any of you had any questions about the subject. The only, in the back first, but I'll only ask that you help me by speaking up loud, and I'll put in a hearing aid to be sure I can hear you. Yes, please.
Thank you, very interesting. Your comments indicated that his intelligence network was quite well organized and sophisticated, which is a little surprising given his career and how the war evolved, etc. That, you know, suddenly he's the only continental officer of any stature in the state and gathers up whatever resources he can to resist and so forth, which does not put you in a very good position to organize something real sophisticated. But your comments sort of suggested that maybe it was a fairly sophisticated structure. So could you elaborate on that a little farther?
I might have misled you. What happened basically was that the people of the state had so suffered under the, you might say, the Tories and those people. They knew they had only one place they could go to do something good for the state, and that was Francis Marion's group. There was no place they could go. You heard about Gadsden earlier, the fact that he was moderate. There's a lot of that there. but there's only one place you could go if you believed and felt it was important to do something against the British. You had to look up and find a way to help Francis Marion. But the terrible terrorism acts of the Tories is what drove them to the only man to take the thing that was Francis Marion.
Can I ask the second question?
Sure.
Of course, you
I'm not
mentioned.
sure that's a good answer for you, but that's.
Well, your answer is about what I expected, because that was my perception of his intelligence
You're quite right.
community as well, that it was not highly organized, but it kind of evolved that way. The next question is, when Doyle went to Snow's Island and found Snow's Island, that most likely resulted from somebody defecting on Marion as well.
I believe that too. It turns out that you don't always know that. Sorry. He's the guy that told, I thought you had to wear a tie. I didn't think that I'd have to use a microphone either. In the spy business, sometimes you have a mole. If you don't know, if he's not a defector that you know about, but he's working with the enemy and you don't know it. It's called a mole. And it's long been thought that that was the case there, but nobody has any evidence or proof. It had to be something like that, didn't it? I agree with you.
Comment something about codes and ciphers used during the American Revolution.
The question is about codes and ciphers. That's fascinating because it turns out that George Washington had such a sophisticated spy network that he set up a system of to conceal and protect his networks. He gave all of his agents a code. They were 3-digit numbers. Every name and every place was given and committed to memory. Washington himself was known as Agent 711. New York was 727. Long Island had a different number and so on. Agent 355 was 355. And these were all committed to memory. Nothing was ever written down. But the British often used codes when they communicated with their agents, if you will, or whoever. So there was a lot of encoding in those days. And guess what? Washington had code breakers, and they were good. He had, one of them was a Presbyterian minister who was an amateur code breaker. And there's another one, I think his name was Samuels, but he had one of them in the Continental Congress was an amateur code breaker. And in one occasion, one of the traders that was working with the British had written a coded letter to the British commander in New York. And that coded letter, he had to get it to the general in New York City. And this trader or spy that had written this message in code had given it to a girlfriend who was supposed to give it to another man on a ship who would transport this coded letter to the commanding general in New York. But somehow the letter never got there. The letter turned out by this girlfriend had looked at that letter, and she said, that's strange writing. So that letter worked its way back to Washington, and Washington called in his 2 code breakers, and then they independently broke the code and came up with the same message. And then because of that, Washington was able to capture the traitor in his ranks, who turned out to have been, I think he was the head of the he was a doctor, medical doctor, and so when they captured him, and he denied that he did it, but when they showed the coded message, that finished him off. But they had no laws to prosecute a traitor at the time. It was early in the war, so they put this traitor on a schooner to ship him off to the Caribbean, one of the islands down there, to get him out of the country. But as the schooner rounded the corner, it seemed to hesitate and stop. But later on, when the schooner arrived in Barbados, where it's headed, it turned out that man was not on board. He disappeared at sea somehow, or tossed overboard, we don't know. But anyway, but there was code. Now, code breaking has been a key to intelligence operations forever. And, you know, it was a breaking in World War I of the German Zimmermann telegram that helped convince Americans that they had to go to war and join the British in World War I. But that's no story everybody knows. Yes, sir.
Every now and then I run across legends, allegations, that Agent 355 was the madam of a brothel much frequented by British officers. Do you know anything at all? Are there any hints that you've uncovered about that?
Let's say that I didn't quite get that. She was what?
She was the madam of a brothel, a house of prostitution, much used, much frequented by British officers.
No, I've heard that, but it's not true. It's well documented. It turns out that she was a what's the religion that the very pacifist?
Quaker.
Yeah, she was a Quaker, and she turned out to be the common law wife of the American spy who heading up that ring, Major Townsend, I believe, who was also a Quaker. But the fact is, during the war, they could not get married because if they got married, there would be an obvious connection between Townsend, who was the undercover head of the operation, and her. What she did, she did operate, and she knew all of the British officers. That is true, but I believe I read everything that's in print on the subject. But and she did know Andre, Major Andre, and when he was captured, they rounded up everybody, and they rounded up her because she had been known. And she actually had met with them in one of the coffee houses and it turned out the well-known Tory who ran the New York newspaper, and everyone thought that he was a pro-British Tory. It turned out he was one of Washington's spies also, and he knew, and he visited with her as well. But when they rounded up all of these people, they put her on that prison ship. I've never had any documentation at all about that.
Mike's too close together.
Oh, sorry. Too many mics. Yes, sir.
Could you describe the British spying efforts on behalf of the British?
Yes. The British had spy operations, but they didn't come anywhere near to match what Washington had. They mainly had American volunteers working for the British. They did not, in their own case, have a network like Washington. Take John Andre. His job was to work with the Americans who were traitors that were Tories willing to support the British. That was their only input. Washington had an active, proactive network that infiltrated the ranks, reported to him. The British didn't have anything like that. The only thing that when Benedict Arnold defected, that was a traumatic thing to everybody because he was one of the best American generals in the war. But the British, they gave credit at the end. Washington outspied us. It was that simple. They couldn't match him. Yes, sir.
Did Marion have any spies among the Tories that you know of?
I can't name them, but I know he had several. As a matter of fact, there were several Tories that appeared to be Tories, but they didn't want to blow their cover. They were safe living in the cities, but many of the Tories were actually reporting to Marion. Marion did a better job in many ways when he never named, that I'm aware of, after the war, he kept his mouth shut. He never did it. And Washington did the same. But some of them came out, like John Honeyman became known after the war for Washington spies, and but Marion was smart about it. It was dangerous to be known as a Tory working with. Now they were so bloody, that Civil War. It's easy to understand why all of these Tories fled the country. They had to leave. They went to England. They went to Canada, and a lot of them went to the French Zone. They became known as Arcadians. And generations later, some of them came back down into Louisiana and became known as Cajuns, short for Arcadians. But no, they had to leave. And it was really, it was quite an interesting time to see all these thousands and thousands of people flee the country. They lost the war. Tough. Yes, sir.
It's funny that you had said that, because 2 years ago I was up in St. John's province up there, and they're fighting right now with their image. And of course, Quebec wants to break from Canada and develop their own country up there. That's what they're trying to do. And these people who you just spoke to about being shipped from South Carolina up there because they were Tories, said, if that happens, I want to become part of America. They're really serious about it.
That's true. One more back up. Maybe we better call it off after this question.
Well, it just seems like the way Marion operated, he was more prone to potentially having goals than Washington, simply because he had so few resources to work with, and people would volunteer to be part of his brigade. Many times people that he could not have known much about them and so forth. And apparently he overcame that by not sharing his plans very much.
Well, he did something else. It turned out in the beginning, he was on his own. The Continental Army, primarily the Green, they were in North Carolina, and they left him on his own. He literally fought with, many of his men brought their own rifle, the guns, and they only had 3 bullets per man. It was only after his success in the early days that the Continental Army finally recognized this man is worth something. Matter of fact, he's the only asset we've got. They finally recognized his value, and that's when he was promoted to general. And then later on, is when he became so successful, they began to support him, giving him ammunition and things. That's when he then became part of the Continental Army. But in the beginning, he was all on his own. It was amazing. It was great. Thank you, gentlemen.
Not so fast. If you go to Google and Google Gene Poteat, you'll see a lot of neat stuff that he did since he left the Citadel. And one is a talking, and if you could give them just a few words that you could give to them. But the report was just recently, I guess, declassified, and there were a lot of fighter pilots, a lot of bomber pilots that learned about the talking. We always joked about, wonder how they figured that out, and how they figured that out is a long story, but if you can give a short story.
It turns out I spent my career in the CIA and still work there part-time. And but I'm an electrical engineer and physicist, and people don't expect a spy to do that. But in my early days, when By the way, the CIA had no spies in the Soviet Union until long after Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. Not a single spy in there. So the only thing we had was technology. That's when we built the U-2 was flying over Russia purely because we had no spies. And that's how we got our intelligence. We kind of went downhill over the years since Washington and Marion. But, and even in those days, the Congress supported intelligence compared to today. Nonetheless, the U-2 airplane got shot down and the CIA was trying to build satellites to replace it. But we had 12 satellite failures in a row. We didn't think we'd ever see satellites make the grade. However, we had to have a stopgap measure in case the satellites didn't work and the U-2 can't fly anymore, it gets shot down. The CIA was building the first stealth airplane in order to fly over the Soviet Union. And this started, I was working on it in 1960. But the stealth airplane turned out to be the forerunner of the SR-71 Blackbird. And President Eisenhower had told the CIA, and I was in the meeting when I heard him say, that new airplane that's so high and fast and stealthy, you have to prove to me first that it's invisible to Soviet radars before you can fly it. And after that meeting, they said, Gene, you're the only electrical guy in our group here. It's your job to find out. I went home and got sick. But eventually we found a way to electronically simulate this stealth airplane into the Russian radars. We could spoof the radars, and we could. And the Russians had a new radar, a very big, massive early warning radar that we thought it was the nemesis of our stealth airplane. So what we did was we could inject a signal into their radar, and they would see an airplane coming at them, or going to overfly them. And we could simulate an airplane as big as a B-52 bomber, or something as small as a bird, or anything in between, including our stealth airplane, which we knew what it looked like on radar. And we ran these operations around the world. We ran them from ships, from islands, north of Masawa. Someone's been to Masawa, but we did it from Wakkanai, Japan, ships at sea. We ran the operations from submarines with just our antenna sticking up. And then we had a team of linguists from NSA. We could listen to the Soviets' reaction to our false target, our electronic airplane. And we were operating out of Cuba. It was a lot more fun when they brought their modern radars to Cuba. It's better to operate in the Caribbean out of Key West than in the Arctic from a submarine. So we're very happy. But suddenly we found the Russians and Cubans would launch fighters against our airplane that was not there. We had a lot of fun, I might add. But one night, we always operated at night so they know what we were up to. And then one night, they launched fighters against our plane, but we could always turn our controls and keep ahead of them. They could never catch us. But one night, we heard the Cuban fighter pilot radio his ground controllers. He said, I have the intruding aircraft in sight. Now it's at night, and there ain't no airplane up there. So we didn't know what to think, but we had Russian and Spanish linguists with us, listening to them. And finally, we're all standing up now, and we're on a ship out of Key West. And we heard the Cuban fighter pilot say, I like permission to shoot him down. And by now, we really got our attention. And so the ground controller gave him permission to shoot it down. And he finally said, I'm starting my firing pass now. And and the operator of our system put his finger on the on-off switch. I said, yes, turn it off. He turned our system off. And we didn't hear anything for a while, but finally the ground controller radioed the pilot and said, you must have got him. He disappeared off of our radar. So we got back to Key West and to our headquarters, which was in Sloppy Joe's Bar. And we made a big cardboard hero medal and pinned it to our technician that turned the system off for shooting himself down.
Lunch is in the back. Go off this side.
Yeah.
Both sides.